Good afternoon, students. This afternoon we're going to be talking a bit about a very interesting essay topic, which you may or may not, hopefully you may, be writing a practice essay on. We're going to talk a little bit about the key terms in the topic this afternoon and flesh out some of the key ideas in the text. As you know, there have been some debates about the interpretation of the text, and today we're here to flesh out the complexities of the text and figure out why it is we do debate and can't quite agree on how we interpret all the characters and the themes within the text. We're looking at one of the ones you were given on your sheet. You may have been given by your teacher in class recently. The topic is Wolff's protagonist faces an acute moral dilemma, unable to reconcile what he knows to be true with what he feels to be true. Do you agree? So today we're going to flesh out a bit of a discussion about this. This is by no means an essay plan for you to follow to the letter, because then you would end up doing a very bad job. You need to actually be thinking for yourself, obviously, and providing textual support for your interpretation. Key words in this topic are obviously protagonist, so the main character, we're talking clearly about Toby here. Faces, all right, so how does he face this moral dilemma? And I think the word acute there is particularly important. Is it acute? Does he face a moral dilemma? I guess you have to ask yourself that question. And if he does, is it acute? Does he face a dilemma? If he does, what type of dilemma? Is it about identity, as the topic suggests? And if so, is it a moral dilemma, or maybe is it a different type of dilemma that he may face? The term reconcile is important there. So there's the sort of the conflict between what he wants in his imagination and then who he feels he really is based on his actions. So obviously, do you agree is fairly straightforward. You need to form a line of argument to this topic about how you're going to go about it. So let's open the discussion.
Mm-hmm. I think there are a couple of complexities to this question that you need to be aware of before you start. The first one, of course, is that the question opens with Wolff's protagonist. So what we're seeing here is that through the memoir we have senior Tobias Wolff developing a protagonist, which is, of course, himself. The first part, as Miss Buzzard pointed out, you have to decide on whether or not this protagonist faces an acute moral dilemma. So that's the first thing that you need to explore. And then the second part is that whether or not he is unable to reconcile what he knows to be true with what he feels to be true. So again, the repetition of the word true and what is truth within this memoir is quite poignant given this topic.
It's quite a complex topic, isn't it?
In terms of where we would go for here, personally, I would be agreeing with this statement, and my contention would be that does he face an acute moral dilemma? I think he does. I would probably dissect the word acute and start looking at that in a little bit more detail. And of course, the moral dilemmas he faces and will be probably where I'll be going in terms of planning my paragraphs and looking at certainly the way in which Wolff develops these moral dilemmas in terms of either key scenes or characters or events, or even sort of the how, so the structures and features employed by the writer to explore the moral dilemmas encountered.
That's interesting. So you think that, or your reading is that he does actually face a moral dilemma. The word that I struggled there with was moral. It's clear that we see many different kinds of dilemmas, and I think that it would be good for students to be able to articulate the different kinds of challenges and hurdles and dilemmas that he faces. I wondered whether it was technically, accurately, a moral dilemma. How did you go about thinking about that?
Well, I think interestingly, because the question itself refers both to Wolff and the protagonist. I think the protagonist, as a young Toby or Jack Wolff in this instance, he does face a moral dilemma. So in terms of moral in this instance, it's about the notions of right or wrong and the blurred boundaries, which is, of course, the dilemma for this character. He has an incredible problem or difficulty or conflict or flaw in able to distinguish what his morals are during this time. He's almost unable to articulate that. And we see that in a number of instances within the memoir, where he knows that his actions and his thoughts and who he thinks he really is are at odds. And I think therein lies that dilemma.
Yeah, and the young boy is not really able to express that. It's the older Wolff that interjects with that reflection that Toby doesn't know why he's doing the thing he does. And this whole business of what he feels and what he knows comes up a lot, like with Father James, not being able to admit his sins, not really understanding why he can't do it, but feeling to some degree that he's a cheat. Even when he manipulates his mother to get what he wants, there's this feeling of self-loathing because he's not being who he feels he is, but what he is doing. When he writes, forges the letter to Hill, that's a really, is something I would focus on to answer this question, because even though he's lying, he feels there's truth to it, and he does struggle to reconcile that what he's writing is a lie, but in some way is the truth. So there are a couple of pivotal moments, even not being able to apologise to the Welches. He's not able to articulate at the time why it is that he can't say sorry, except there's this, perhaps, this clash between who he is, what he knows is right, but not being able to follow through with it.
So I think that you've articulated a couple of things there. I don't see them as moral dilemmas. I see them as psychological dilemmas. So he experiences this cognitive dissonance between his real and ideal selves. That isn't a moral dilemma. That isn't about right or wrong.
True.
That is
Although
about
in the moment,
who I am.
It's about
That's about
perception.
identity. Yeah.
So you could take that would be quite a sophisticated answer to be able to articulate where the moments are not just about right and wrong. It seems on the surface that apologising is about right and wrong, confessing is about right and wrong, forging a letter is morally wrong.
Yes,
but you're right,
the
there's a
thing is,
deeper level to it.
Yeah, well, and all those things, he never really... So this is where I get to the heart of this kind of, is it a moral dilemma kind of question. Just like Galileo, we say that he doesn't actually wrestle with his morality. You never see this internal conflict, this whether or not I've done the right thing. You see him do the wrong thing. And I think we see Toby consistently do the thing that he knows society thinks is immoral, but you never see him say, question whether or not he should do that thing.
See, I would argue completely against that. I think, as I would, I do see it as a moral dilemma, and I think that the cognitive dissonance is intrinsically linked with the moral decisions that he faces and the obstacles that he faces throughout. I think his search for identity, and when you said the psychological dilemma, I don't think you can distinctly explore the psychological dilemma he faces without referring to the moral dilemmas.
Okay, so to do that, you've got to look at this wrestle between right and wrong, and you've got to link that to Toby. So can we find evidence in the text of him wrestling with, not with identity, you wouldn't want to link them, but with the right and wrong?
He does on page 241.
Okay,
he talks about when he's at Hill, this moral issue of cheating and, breaking the rules at school. And he says that he's really scared by the fact that he's not able to do the right thing. It scared me to do so poorly when so much was expected. And to cover my fear, I became one of the school wild men, a drinker, a smoker. If I worked hard, I could just stay afloat. As soon as I relaxed, I went under. When I felt myself going under, I panicked and did wild man things that got me in trouble. So you're right, it's not an overt discussion of, I shouldn't do the wrong thing. There's almost an element of him being out of control in a way. But
I don't
think
see him actually thinking there.
grappling, this is the wrong thing to do.
No, he just does it.
I think that maybe the right and wrong aspect comes in with wanting to belong. So he wants to be the better version of himself so that he can belong and be happy in society. And in order to belong, you need to do the right thing. So I feel like there's something in that. But the other problem with that is that society often values the wrong things, according to Wolff. The patriarchy's flawed. The male role models are all flawed.
And also, I suppose, looking at within its historical and social context regarding the American dream and post-world America, what we see with references to this squeaky clean vision of what life could and should be like for them, which of course never measures up in any aspect of his life. I think to move on from the aspect of the question about moral dilemma and to move on to the second one, whether or not he is unable to reconcile what he knows to be true with what he feels to be true. Do you disagree with that? Does he reconcile what he knows to be true with what he feels to be true?
Yeah, I don't think we see that in the narrative. I don't see a reconciliation in the narrative, and we're left with this final moment of him. It's beautiful. The closing image of him in the car with his friends singing hymns. And I mean, to add even more complexity to that, they're not friends. Right, they're not even friends.
He's not friends with Chuck Bowles.
So he doesn't belong with the people in the car. He doesn't believe in the words that he's singing.
But isn't the memoir itself like trying to reconcile who he is now with who he once was?
Oh, okay.
So I feel like he is able to reconcile it to an extent within the narrative interjections.
But the protagonist doesn't. So there's a really good complexity.
Well, the protagonist, are you talking about young Toby, or
I believe so.
So we're separating him completely.
I think it'd probably be good to build a consensus around that term. From my perspective, I believe that the protagonist is separate to the narrator. So the protagonist, as you said earlier, is the fictional younger self, the fictionalized younger self, whereas the narrator is the adult voice.
Well, certainly with what I've been saying to my students is about the narrative interjection of senior Tobias Wolff.
Yes.
And I suppose therein lies the dramatic irony of whether or not he's successful, whether or not it's optimistic or pessimistic. He is a successful writer because we're studying his memoir at Year 12. But
Could I just stop you there? And I've had this discussion with many different teachers, and I think I've come to the point where I'm able to see where this is in the text, because my retort to that has been, but we don't see it. We don't see it within the narrative of the text. It's not something that Wolff wants us to focus on because he only selectively shows us these negative things. But we do actually see it, and I think you've pointed this out before to me in the past. We see it in his narrative, or the voice itself. It's in the literary art, the beauty of his rhetoric and his art. And
his reflection and sort of self-awareness that he gains through writing it. So I think maybe if students can really differentiate in their introduction the difference between the protagonist as young Toby and the narrator as Tobias Wolff, and that way you could definitely argue that as a protagonist he is unable to reconcile it. But as a narrator, he does reconcile it.
Oh, that's nice.
This may be a nice way of looking at it. Anyway, I've got to head off, but good luck with the rest of the discussion.
I think certainly this essay hinges on the difference between, or the distinction between, what he knows and what he feels.
Yes.
And both of which need to be explored in relation to truth. So students, when approaching this, need to have a very clear understanding and line of contention regarding their interpretation of...
what does he know to be true, and what is it that he feels to be true? A lot of this, what he knows to be true, like you said, is about himself and about society. He knows the way things are. He knows how he's perceived. And he's obsessed with being perceived in a bad light. He's worried that Mr. Welch, obviously is ashamed of him, he wants Mr. Bolger to like him because he's a priest. He feels ashamed when he's caught by the pharmacist lady. He can see the disappointment in her eyes that she could see through him. With Marion, with Dwight. So to some extent I would talk about that. That's what he knows to be true of them and what they're thinking of him. But then going back to the letter he writes, the forged letter to Hill, that's what he feels to be true, that he is this successful student who has all this potential, everything that he writes. And it's also, I guess, to do with his class. He knows that he belongs essentially to a fairly working class that is excluded from the American dream, but he feels like that's the wrong place for him, that he actually does belong with the elite, possibly because his family come from that kind of background, that he's kind of stuck between classes, nearly accessing the American dream, but not quite. Of course, like you said, we know that he does eventually actually move into what he feels to be true. His life does become that.
I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent both protagonist and narrator, depending on how we're going to clarify this. And I think his ability to reflect upon, in both instances, on the American dream and on life and on sort of the artificial nature of American society during this time, is incredibly insightful. That he sees what he's doing, and he sees how he's acting and how he's presenting himself, and also how he's being perceived. So in terms of looking at the idea of truth, we have to ask ourselves before writing this essay, is what is the true Jack? Is the true Jack how people see him, who he is on the inside wanting to escape?
Yeah.
and so asking ourselves essentially, what is that true identity?
Yeah. Well, like with questions like this, I think we need to encourage our students, and I encourage you guys, go to the text and say what you know. Don't try and embellish too far from the text. Go to the text, say what you know, and be specific. So,
and it's okay to say maybe that there isn't a clear answer, because Wolff doesn't give us a clear answer.
Yes.
So I think it's okay to state that, so long as you're supporting it with evidence from the text, that it is ambiguous, this dilemma, and that no, there doesn't seem to quite be a reconciliation, mainly because he can't articulate what it is that he knows.
Yes.
He can articulate what he feels retrospectively.
Yeah.
But at the time, he's not able to, and that, I guess, is the dilemma of knowing you have potential, but being frustrated and thwarted in some regards.
And even once he's offered this opportunity, of course, once he arrives at Hill, and the voice of wisdom interjects yet again and says, of course he was going to succeed. He was never going to succeed in that environment. Because, I mean, we have that...
Oh, that's so sad.
Almost that... It's almost humorous, but we can't help but almost sort of draw some sort of empathy with Jack by this stage of the memoir, in that he receives the call approving his scholarship and his acceptance to this elite school, and then he returns to a class where he's failing and he has no idea what's going on. So I mean, the distinction between what he's aspiring to and what he thinks he is capable of deep down, which he may very well be, is certainly at odds with where he's at.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think I found it useful to maybe try and find the right term. So, true is tricky. So you could talk about subjective truth and objective truth. Objective truth, by today's standards, would refer to behaviour, because objectively behaviour can be measured and observed. It can be observed.
With relation to society, maybe in their expectations of what they perceive as true, right
and what
behaviour.
he does. So what he says and what comes out of his mouth for other people, and what he does, his behaviours. Whereas subjective truth seems to be what he's writing in these applications. These are things that he feels. And there are subjective truth there of him, but they are not exhibited in his behaviour. So we can say that, I think.
But I would say therein lies the moral dilemma.
Okay.
I mean, that would be.
But he doesn't wrestle with that. There's no dilemma. Dilemma means, obviously, dilemma is this: do I choose that or do I choose this? Whereas I wish, for Toby's sake, we saw him have a dilemma. He doesn't. He just kind of just runs with it.
See, I think that the struggle between what he knows and what he feels with regard to truth or his true self, no, I don't think he's able to reconcile it throughout the memoir. But is it a moral dilemma? I think between the lines of almost every passage on the page, all I can hear is the way in which he struggles.
Right. I can see that struggle, and I think if I was going to articulate it in a way that I feel comfortable, I would say that the narrator actually has this moral wrestling,
Yes.
and almost maybe I'm embellishing too far and not talking about the text here, but maybe wishes his former self saw the moral ambiguity here. I'm probably reading too far, I think, than the text. But the narrator definitely doesn't speak well about the moral choices of his former self. And there we see a moral dilemma, a moral wrestling, almost, I like to see it as a confessional almost of, these are all the shameful acts of my youth.
But that's what's so great about English, is that
Right.
both of you can write a top-notch essay with either of these contentions, because you are providing enough evidence to support your ideas that there is no right or wrong. There is just opinion, which is fantastic. So I think students could take either route so long as they fully justify their opinions the way you have done and the way that you've done as well.
So I suppose, just to finish off the vodcast, if we have our final thoughts, the first question is to Mr. Simons. Does Wolff's protagonist face an acute moral dilemma? Yes or no?
No, definitely not.
And Mrs. Aziz?
Yeah, I think I agree. I'm in between you two. That he definitely faces some kind of dilemma. Whether it's acutely moral in nature could be debated. But I do feel like he is a bit torn. He's sad that he disappoints his mum at times and disappoints others, and he wishes to be something else. So I do feel there is a dilemma.
And the
yourself?
second, I think he does.
Yes.
I think he does face an acute moral dilemma. In terms of the second aspect of the question, is he unable to reconcile what he knows to be true with what he feels to be true within the memoir? What do you think, Mr. Simons?
Yeah, absolutely unable. In both instances, I think we need to clarify, the protagonist is unable to do both of those things. The narrator, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
And I would agree with that as well. And I think certainly with your essay writing, what you have to do, particularly at the planning stages, either independently or with your peers, is to thrash out some of the key ideas and themes, as we have done this afternoon, just before you get started. Because from that, then you need to arm your piece with evidence and map out where you're going to go.
Wonderful. Buttons. I don't know how to turn it off.